What is going on, guys, and welcome to this very first video in building this drag and drop functionality. So initially I thought this was going to just be a single video, but there's actually a lot to cover in it, so that's why I'm going to separate it out into a couple of different videos so it's not like super overwhelmingly long. But before we get started, I just wanted to introduce you guys to the brand new beta for Time of Castles, which is what I'm actually playing right here. And if you guys want to see development videos on how a lot of the features in this game were actually built, I have a series dedicated to the actual construction of this game, and I will be adding more videos to that series very soon. If you'd like to watch those videos, I'm going to leave a link down in the description as well as a link on the screen in the top right hand corner right now. And lastly, I've been wanting to do giveaways for you guys on this channel, and I'm thinking that later on, once this game gains some popularity and we've got some more content, I'm gonna do giveaways through these videos for game content, so you can get like cool items and like just stuff that you won't be able to get in the game unless you watch these videos. But for this first giveaway, I'm gonna be choosing one individual to get 2 free web development sessions that are 1 hour each, in which you'll get to work one-on-one with me through Skype, and it'll be completely your time, so we can talk about or build whatever you'd like web development related. And all you have to do to enter to win this is just subscribe to my channel, like this video, and then just leave a constructive comment in the comment section below. And what I mean by constructive is pretty much anything. I mean, you could comment on what you thought about this video or this giveaway or the game or what I should make videos on in the future. And I will be choosing the winner of this giveaway when this channel hits 1,000 subscribers. So right now I think we're at about 927. So when this channel hits 1,000, I will choose the winner and I will let them know directly. Alright, awesome guys. So let's get to the drag and drop video. Alright, so before we get started, let's just take a look at the outcome, like the final product that we're going to end up with after these few videos. So we actually are able to click on these different images in this gallery, and if we drag them around, you'll notice that we can reorder the images in any way we'd like. And so it's a pretty cool effect. It's pretty smooth. It looks pretty nice, I think. And I built this originally for a video gallery, but I figured a image gallery is basically the same thing since that's how I was using it before anyways. So now let's just take a look at how we're actually building this. So if we jump over to our brackets editor, and I should have mentioned that before, so if you don't currently have a text editor, the one that I'm going to be using for this video is Brackets, and if you just head over to brackets.io, you can download it for free. It's a pretty cool text editor that I like to use. And we're going to be building this from scratch with Vanilla.js, so you don't need to have any previous knowledge. I mean, if you're watching this, you have some interest in web development, so I expect you know already what HTML and CSS and JavaScript are, but if you don't, you can still follow along with this video because we're going to be starting from a blank document. But let's take a look at everything that we've got going on here. So at the top, we've got all of our styles for all the elements that we're going to be using, and then we just have one single div that we're using because we're putting all of our slots in with JavaScript, so we're actually just using one container div that holds everything for us. And then if we just scroll through, we have all of our script, which mainly this page is just JavaScript. So we have all of our variables that we're going to be using, and then we of course have our different functions that we're going to be using in here as well. And if I just go ahead and let's just shrink some of this stuff down so we can see how many functions we're actually using inside of here. And so you'll notice we've got a whole bunch of stuff going on in here, but it honestly isn't that complicated. I mean, if I open some of these up, this stuff might look kind of weird to you if you're not used to programming with JavaScript, but we're going to go through all of this step by step. Like I said, we're going to be starting with a fresh document, which I'm going to actually go ahead and just make that for us now. So this page is called our index.html, and I'm just going to right click here and just create a new file. And we're just going to call it our index2.html. So this is a completely blank page that we're working with here. And what I'm going to do is actually just split this. So we're going to get a nice vertical split. And I'm going to throw the original over on the right side. And the reason I'm going to do that is just so that you guys can see exactly what the final product looks like, so you can see what we're working on currently and how it comes together and eventually looks like this here on the right hand side. So we're just going to start by building all of our basic tags. So we've got our HTML tag that is going to be the wrapper around our entire project. And then we're going to first start with our head, and then we're going to jump over to our body. And so now quickly inside of our body, I'm actually just going to add in that div because it's really the only div that we have sitting inside of here. it's the only static div we're going to be using. We're going to be adding obviously other divs with JavaScript, but in this case we have our single div that we're going to set up because that's basically where we need to put everything. So then we're going to jump inside of our head, and let's take a look at what kind of stuff we want to start with in our head. So the first thing we actually have here at the top, and we can add this in, it doesn't really matter honestly, it's just the title of the page. So we can actually add in that drag and drop title. So the next thing I want to add in this head is we can actually just put this link in here. So this is just a link to get a Google font, and that's just because I don't really like the default fonts that browsers generally have, so I just will add in a nicer looking font. And then of course we can add in our style tag because this is where we're going to have to style all of our elements inside our project. So the first thing that I'm doing here in our styles is I'm actually giving our body, which our body is basically the entire window, we're giving our body this background color. So it's just to give it a nice color rather than the solid white color that it normally has. So this is kind of like a nice light beige color. And so the next part is kind of a little bit of a reset. Since I don't have a full CSS reset in my project, I'm kind of just adding a margin 0 to everything, a padding 0 to everything, and then I'm just going to copy the font because this is where we're actually applying that font to all of our elements. So now if we just jump over to our drag and drop again, I'm going to go ahead and open that index2 file that we have. So now you'll see that it's basically just our beige color for the entire window that we have here. And that's exactly what we'd expect because we haven't actually added anything yet. So now I'm just going to jump straight into the scripting part because we really don't have anything left to do until we actually start adding some of this code. So let's go ahead and create a new script tag now. And inside of this, we're just going to start, as I usually do with a lot of these modules, just with an anonymous function. And so by anonymous, it just means that it doesn't have a name. It's just a function that will get called on its own when the page first loads. So we put this at the bottom of our body just so that all of our other elements have already rendered and we can use them inside of our script basically when it gets to the bottom of the page. So let's scroll down a little bit here on the right side and take a look at what we're using. So the first variable we're defining in here is for the document, and I generally just do underscore doc, and then I set that equal to the window document so that it's a little easier to access. And then we'll actually just write our first named function inside of our anonymous function called init. So this will be the function that gets called first at the bottom after everything's been defined. And so if we take a look at what this init is actually calling, the first function that we're calling and the first function that we'll actually build will be our add image slots function. And so that's probably all we're going to get to build for this video. So let's go ahead and get started with that function. So if we call, it hasn't been defined yet, so what we'll do is actually create that function and then we'll call it. So if we create a function called add image slots, and now we want to make sure that that function is being called inside of our init because that's going to be the first thing that we actually do here. And so if we scroll down a little bit on our right side and take a look at what this function's actually doing. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to define our loop variables because we know we're going to need to run through a loop. So we're going to be defining I as our iterator, which starts at 0, and then we're going to have a length property, but that length is actually going to get set to one of our variables that we have defined up here. So in this case, we have a variable for the actual number of slots. So if the person wants to change the number of slots that are actually on the screen, they can do so. For instance, if I just jump over here and let's say I change this to 9, and then we jump back to our original, and if I refresh it, you'll notice now there's only 9 instead of 12. So it's a really handy variable to have because obviously we want to be able to adjust that number. So if we take a look, we want to make sure that we actually include that variable over here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. We're going to do num of image slots, and we're going to set that equal to 12 over here. And while we're at it, we're actually going to add that second variable, which is the num of images per row. So in this case, you can tell it how many images you want to be in a single row. So in the case of our demo over here, we obviously have 3 images in a single row, but if we were to change that value, so say I come in here and I change this to 4 and refresh, you'll notice now we have 4 in a row, so we can still do all the same functionality as before. We can just change how many there are in that row. So over here on our left hand side, we've set that to 3 now. And so what we're going to do is we want to now set the length equal to that number of image slots per row, because that's going to be what we're running through here. And then we also just want to define one more variable, but we're not actually going to give it a value yet. It's going to be our item property, which is actually the item that we're creating here. And we're actually just going to be creating a new div with that item. So let's actually start running through this loop now. So to write our loop, we've got our for, and while I is less than length I plus plus. So we're going to be running through now, in this case, that 12 that we have set here. That's what's getting set, and we're going to be running through this code 12 times so that we can draw all of those slots on the screen. So what we'll do first is inside of this loop, we want to set item equal to that doc, and we want to create an element now. So we're creating a div in this case, so we pass it that div name. So now that we've defined that item as a new div that we just created, we haven't actually done anything with the div yet. So we want to first give this thing some attributes. So we'll call to set an attribute, and we want to set the class, and we'll just set it to our DD slot. DD stands for drag drop. And so now before we go any further, let's just take a look at what our actual styles are on this class. So if we scroll up on our right hand side, we can see that DD slot is defined right here. So the things we're actually going to want to include is we'll go ahead and add the styles to that up here. The first thing we want to say is our DD slot needs a float left property. So float left is just going to make those things sit next to each other nicely. And then we're going to have an outline on this, which is where that dashed border comes from. And we're going to do 2 pixels solid, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy this color so I don't mess it up. And then we'll give it a little bit of an outline offset, which is, in this case, is negative 15 pixels, which is going to make that outline smaller than the actual frame of the div. And lastly, we're just going to give this a position of relative. And then before I go any further, I just wanted to add in the styles that we're using here. Now these styles are for our actual DD container, which we're not actually defining a class there for that. So we don't really need to. We can actually just come in here and we'll just use the ID that we defined. So drag drop, we can go ahead and give it the same styles that that has. So we're giving it a width of 1,000 pixels in this case, and then we're just giving it a margin top of 20, and we're giving it an auto left and right, so it would center it in the middle of the screen for us, and then 0 on the bottom. And then we also need to make sure that this is positioned relative, because we will have some absolutely positioned items inside of it. So there's one more thing on this container that we're using, which is actually our DD CLR class, which is for clear. And what this clear class does is it basically makes sure that we account for the floated elements inside of our div so that it takes up the full height. Although in this case it doesn't really matter because we don't actually have other elements on the screen, so it's not really a big deal if we don't include it in this case. And so just because of that, I'm not actually going to include that in this situation. So let's jump back down to the for loop that we've got going on right now for our slots. So we set our class attribute and we added in those styles over here on the left hand side. So the next piece that we're doing is we're actually going to skip this part because we don't actually need it in this situation. I needed it before, but we don't need it in this case. So I'm going to skip right down to the styling. And so we need to set these styles using script because we don't know necessarily how many slots they want and how many we need per row, so we need to actually be able to use these variables to set those values. So firstly, we're going to be setting the width. So what are we going to be setting the width to in this case? We know that we want a percentage width, so we're going to take 100%, meaning 100% of the entire thing, and we need to divide this by that number of images per row. So in this case, if there's 3 images per row, it's going to be 33.333%. Whereas if it were 4, then it would be 25% and so on. So we're getting that percentage width of the full container. And then of course we just need to make sure that after that number is appended to that string, we add a percent sign to the end so that it knows that it's percent. And then the next thing we're doing is actually a little bit of a hack, because instead of giving this thing a height, we're going to be using a padding bottom. And now the purpose of the padding bottom is to get this div to be correctly proportioned based on the ratio of our image size. So the images that we're dealing with are ideally this ratio. So it doesn't necessarily need to be 1920 by 1080, but as long as it follows that same ratio, that's what we're looking for this to work with. So I'm going to add in a few more variables here. One of them first is going to be for that margin. So we have our image margin bottom variable, and we're going to set that to 30. That means that it's just going to have a 30 pixel margin under each row. And then I'm just going to add in our aspect width and height variables. So the first one is our image aspect width, and that's going to be that 1920. And then our image aspect height is going to be that 1080. So now if we scroll back down, we want to finish our padding bottom. So in this case, we're going to add our colon, and then we're going to add in our 100% divided by that image per row, which you'll notice is the same as the width, which is correct, because now we're going to be taking that amount and we're actually going to be multiplying it by the ratio that we're using here. So our image aspect height divided by our image aspect width. So in this case, if we look at what we're doing, we're taking whatever the width is of this element, because we're basically taking this value here, which is the same as this value, and we're multiplying it by the ratio between the height and the width. So in this case, if we had 4 in a row, let's say for instance, that means each of the widths would be 25%. We're going to be multiplying that by 1080 divided by 1920, which is about 0.56, I believe. Which, if 0.56 times that 25%, that's going to get you obviously almost half of that percentage as the height. So it's a little bit confusing, but believe me, this works. It's kind of a hack, but it definitely is a useful hack. So this is also going to be a percentage as well. And then the last piece that we're adding in here is actually just that static margin bottom variable that we have going on here. And we can just go ahead and add in that image margin bottom, and that's just going to be a pixel value. And then lastly, we're just adding in some inner HTML, and that's just to get those numbers to show up on each of the slots with it, which I think looks pretty good. So we'll actually add that back in. And in this case, we're going to be creating a p tag, and we'll give this p tag a class of the dd slot num, and we'll also be using a useful class to center this text called ddvc, which is for vertical center. And then we'll go ahead and close this p tag, and then real quick in the middle of this, we want to just add in that I plus 1 value, because I starts at 0, but we actually want it to be an additional 1 up. So we want it to start at 1 and count all the way up to our 12 in this case. And then before we can preview this and actually see anything working, we need to actually add this div to our HTML, because we actually haven't done that yet. We've created the div and we've given it attributes, but we haven't actually added it to the DOM. So what we need is we'll first grab that element. So we're going to save our wrap actually as our doc.getElementById, and we're going to be getting that drag drop element that we created up here in our HTML. So now we have that element saved as the wrap, and we're going to actually just call at the bottom of this loop, we want to append the child that we just created to that wrapper. So basically we're going to be taking that item that we just created and we're going to be putting it inside of that wrapper in here, which is going to actually add it to our HTML. Now before we jump over and actually take a look at what this looks like, we first want to just add in these couple classes that we just used but didn't actually define up here. So if we jump back up, we can see what we're doing here. So first, for the slot num, we're going to do our dd slot. In this case, we can just access that num property. And we're going to first do a text-align center to make sure that's right in the middle. And we also want to add that width of 100% to make sure that it takes up the full width. We'll add a position absolute, a font size of 40 pixels, and then we'll just make the color like a really light black color. So we'll do an RGBA, and 000 is black, and then we'll also just make it 0.1 on the opacity so that it's a really light black color. And then the last thing we want to do is just look at our ddvc class, which in this case we're already positioning it absolute, so it's going to overwrite this style. But what we're really looking for is that top 50% and then that translate negative 50% on the Y, because that's going to push our text down 50% and then back up half of its own height. So it's going to make sure that it's centered right in the middle of that box on both the X and the Y in this case. So if we jump up here and let's just add that in. So we want to do our DD VC and we'll give it the position relative just because that will be useful for something else. And then top 50%. And then we just want to give that the transform translate Y of -50%. And I won't worry about all the supports for the other browsers like the WebKit and MOZ. But now we should be able to, I believe that we're doing everything we need to now see these slots show up on the screen. So if we make sure we've saved our file and then we jump over to our new drag and drop that we created, if we refresh this now, you'll see that we've got 3 slots on the screen. But we actually wanted more than 3, so I'm not exactly sure why. Okay, so you guys probably already noticed what the issues were. For one, instead of solid, we actually wanted a dashed outline, which I didn't do previously. And then the only thing is we're using the wrong variable here. We're supposed to be using the number of slots, but we're actually using the number per row, and that's why we're only seeing 3. So now if I save those changes, it should look like we want it to. So as you can see now, we've got our 12 slots with our awesome dashed border around them. And this is perfect because this is exactly where we need to be in order to get our items in here and then eventually have them moving around on these slots. Alright guys, so this is actually all I'm going to do for this first video. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment down below to be entered to win those 2 free sessions. And be sure to stick around for the next video where we're actually going to be covering building those items and then eventually getting them to move around as well. See you then. Peace.